When I was in high school, I worked at a low-rent movie theater in our small town. It had once been the only place to go see a movie, but a new multiplex theater opened in a neighboring town. That drew away a lot of our business and our revenue. So most of the time, the manager wasn't there and we had a skeleton shift of employees. I did multiple jobs, taking tickets, working the concession stand, and cleaning the theaters. I was working one really hot summer day, and I was glad that I worked in air conditioning. But this day, being cool all day long, didn't turn out well for me. Since we were spread thin in terms of staffing, I had the job of cleaning the theaters between the shows. We opened at noon, and there were a few people in the theater that day escaping the heat. That usually meant we had 4 showings of each movie. But this was a long movie, so we only had 3. After the first showing of the one movie, I waited patiently in the back of the theater for everyone to shuffle out before I went in with my broom to clean up the dropped popcorn and other candy wrappers. After what I thought was the last person to walk out, I made my move and entered the theater. I went into action, sweeping up popcorn, picking up candy wrappers and soda cups. My routine was to start up front and move my way back toward the back of the theater. About halfway back, I noticed that I'd missed someone in the back row of the theater. From my perspective, it was only a dark film where someone slumped down in their seat. I dreaded telling people that they had to leave between showings. I just wasn't all that assertive when I was young. So I decided if this person wanted to get out of the heat for an extra showing of the movie, I'd just let it go. This was a busy day, and I was completely swamped with all that I had to do. The second show of the day ended, and once again, it was my job to clean the theater, but the man was still there, sitting just where he had been, in the back of the theater, hidden in shadows. A sense of dread ebbed into my body because I was the person who was going to have to tell him he had to leave. I tried a subtle approach and worked my way back slowly to where he was sitting while I cleaned up the leftover debris as I went. There was almost no light in the area where the man was seated. But we kept the lights low between shows, so he wasn't anything more than a dark form to me. When I got next to him, I said, "Sir, you can't stay in the theater." He didn't move or say anything. I repeated myself, and all he did was let out a low moan, but he didn't move a muscle. All I could think was that I wasn't paid enough to roust this guy out of his seat. He'd paid for one show, and there weren't that many people in the theater anyway. So he really wasn't costing the theater anything, so I just moved on. My anxiety built up for the next few hours. If this man didn't leave after the next showing, I wasn't sure what I would do. What I did know was that the man had to go because it was the last show. We had to do a deeper cleaning before shutting down for the day. I left the theater the man was in for the last cleaning as I cleared out the other theaters after the last showings. After procrastinating for quite a while, I felt the tension building as I made my way to the last theater, desperately hoping that the man had finally left. But as soon as I entered the theater, I saw the familiar figure of the man in the back of it. I thought I could procrastinate longer and clean the place around the man, but I was at my breaking point. I made my way back to the man, and in my gruffest voice, I said he had to leave. This time, he didn't move at all and didn't even make a sound. Maybe he was dead asleep. Maybe he was drunk, or maybe he'd OD'd. Now I was stuck. The manager was nowhere to be seen in the whole complex, so it was up to me to get this guy out of the theater. But every fiber in my being resisted doing anything. So I stood there within reaching distance of the man. What if he reached out and he jumped up and punched me in the face? That's when I noticed something, or better put, noticed the absence of something. The theater was very quiet, but the man wasn't making any noise. I should have heard something. I mean, the man should have been breathing. I finally reached up the courage to grab the man's shoulder, and when I did, it was like that I had released his body from some sort of stasis, and he fell forward into the aisle, landing right on his head. It's a sound I'll never forget. It was a deep, hollow thud. I didn't scream, but I gasped. Then I ran from the theater where I called the manager. When he got there, we both went into the theater and found that the man had been stabbed in the heart. At least that's what the police said after they came. I was grilled into the night by a detective. He asked me if I recalled anyone sitting around the man. But I was so busy and the place was so dark, I didn't remember seeing anyone. It wasn't until a week later that we learned the man had been a part of the local drug trade, and most likely he'd been killed because of that. After that, I was a lot more vigilant when I worked in the theater, checking on who was there and what they were up to. This happened back in the late 1980s. I lived in a mid-sized town in the Rust Belt. We only had one theater in town. It was an old movie palace, having been built in the late 1930s. Too bad the years were not kind to it. Even with upgrades, it was still in rough shape. It didn't help that one of those triplex big box theaters opened in the neighboring town. This drew people away from the old theater and really hurt its box office tank. The spiral down for the old movie palace only accelerated after that. Still, we went to see movies nearly every weekend, even when the projection was a little soft and the sound was a little bit muddy. It was one night when we really knew that the old place was going downhill fast. I took a date one Saturday night, and we sat in the back of the theater just in case we might want to make out. The film was a horror movie with creepy music and lots of jump scares. Anyway, we were about halfway through the movie when my date told me to stop. Stop what? I asked. Brushing my feet, she said. I told her I wasn't doing anything. Well, the movie gave us a big scary scene and we both forgot about what she had said. A couple moments later, the movie got quiet again. I thought I heard some sound coming from the floor. It was a light and high-pitched squeaking sound. But then the movie got loud again. 2 minutes after that, my date drew up her legs and practically jumped into my lap. I thought, oh boy, this might be happening. Then she said, something walked across my feet. I wondered what it could be, so I leaned down and looked down the aisle, and I saw something small and dark moving in the shadows. You know that thing where you convince yourself that the obvious isn't real? It was some old popcorn boxes or candy wrappers. Of course, candy wrappers and popcorn boxes don't walk on four legs. That's when one of the dark forms turned back toward me. The little thing followed it up by squinting its eyes at me, and that's when my date screamed. Fear like that can be infectious, and a moment later another woman screamed, and then people started jumping up and running. My date hopped off my lap and went for the aisle. I wasn't far behind her. I talked to a friend who was the projectionist the next day, and he said he knew the place had a rat problem, but they couldn't afford an exterminator. He just didn't know how bad it really was. Needless to say, no matter how much I love that old theater, if I wanted to see that girl again, it meant going to the new theater out of town. As a teenager, I used to work in a theater in my small hometown. It was basically an easy way to make money and work in air conditioning all day long. I had this one strange thing happen though. There was this older man who would come to the theater from time to time and would almost always have a young girl with him. And it wasn't always the same girl. But that wasn't the strange thing about it. Every one of the girls was blind. Or at least I thought they were, because they all wore sunglasses, and he led them along, gripping their arms and guiding them to the theater. At first I didn't think much of it. Maybe this guy worked at the school for the blind and brought these girls here. But something deep down in my consciousness raised this inner sense of concern. I wouldn't call it alarm, but a question countered my idea of these girls being from the school for the blind. And it was, why didn't he bring male students too? But I wasn't a very assertive type at that age. Plus, I was pretty busy with my job that I really couldn't pay that much attention. The problem was that I should have. There were little clues I should have seen and paid attention to. On one occasion, he brought in a young girl and I was working the lobby. As they came through, the girl's sunglasses slipped down and I could swear she looked right at me. I thought I saw something in her eyes. It was like she was pleading with them, but I brushed it off. It was only a fleeting glance. I had no idea if she really did look my way, or maybe she was really blind and saw nothing. Maybe I didn't want to get involved, but in retrospect, I should have. Something broke through my inertia one afternoon. The man appeared with a new girl. This was the third or fourth, but my memory was muddy. In this instance, I got this sense that this girl was resisting his guiding hand. It was like instead of guiding her, he was tugging her along. When he got close to me, I saw that his knuckles were almost white from how hard he was holding her. My job that day was to take tickets. When they came into the theater, he led them in my direction and I took his ticket. But I looked past him to watch the girl's face. She turned her head in my direction and mouthed a single word. I'm terrible at lip reading, so it didn't come to me what she was trying to say until they were headed down the hallway to the theater doors. She was saying the word, help. That realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I left my station taking tickets and went after them. They were in a hallway and the man held the girl tightly toward him, gripping her with both of his hands. He said something, and I think it was, "What did you say to him?" He must have caught me moving toward them because he looked my way. I started to open my mouth, but he whirled the girl around and dragged her down the hallway toward the exit door. They were about 20 feet away from me and there were people coming toward me, so I couldn't move fast enough to get to them. Before I could even try, he pushed out the exit door, letting the bright light of day stream in. A second later, the door slammed shut and I heard my manager call my name, reprimanding me for leaving my ticket-taking station. Torn by my concern and my call to duty, I stopped and just let it go. It was years later that I learned about the man from my hometown who was kidnapping young city girls, and he sometimes took them out, either to a park or to a movie. He ultimately killed them, but one escaped and got to the police, ending his reign of terror. It was then that I truly regretted my lack of action. If only I'd done something that day, then I might have saved some young girl's life.